All right, so as we get started in this lesson, it covers a lot of things. It covers multiplication, it covers division, also throws in some more of those order of operations that we have to keep track of. Now, let's start with the multiplication and division. When you're working with multiplying and dividing with positive and negatives, all right, that there's some rules there that you have to be aware of. I don't know that I guess I'm just going to write it here on this page, and maybe you should write it in some notes or something so that you can keep track of this. But anytime you're taking a positive value times another positive value, well, you're going to end up with a positive value. It also works if you take a negative times a negative. If you take a negative times a negative, you also end up with a positive answer. So ultimately, what it boils down to is if you have an even number of these negatives, it's going to end up positive. Well, the alternative would be to take maybe a positive times a negative, or switch it around, a negative times a positive. In those two scenarios, you're going to end up with a negative answer. Because notice, there's only one negative in there. So even number of negatives means you're going to have a positive answer. An odd number of negatives means you'll have a negative answer. Because some of our problems, we actually multiply three numbers together. And so you have to kind of add up and see how many negatives there are to see what you want to do with your answer being positive or negative. Okay, so let's just look at some multiplication problems and I just went through the practice problem and I pulled out several examples of what you're going to see on your work. So just some multiplication. Well, there was one I saw that was just a -9 times an 8. So you do need to just be able to multiply numbers together. So 9 times 8 is 72. You can't use a calculator, remember. And so it might be helpful if you wanted to, you could print out the formula sheet from Canvas modules. It does have like a multiplication tables on it. So that might be a little shortcut for you if needed. Ideally, you just know that 9 times 8 is 72. But we have to pay attention to the rules. Notice that there's only one negative term. And since that's an odd number, my answer is going to be a -72. All right, I found another one. Sometimes the math is a little trickier. This one was a 2 times a -13. I don't know, the 2 is low, but I don't know, do you know your 13s? I don't even know that that's on that table. So you might find yourself having to do some side multiplication. Now, before I get going too far though, do you think your answer will be negative or positive? Okay, there's only one negative. So one negative means you're going to want a negative answer. And so maybe you come over here and do this times 2. 2 times 3 is 6. 2 times 1 is 2. Your answer is 26, but because of the negative, you have a -26. All right, let's look at some division. All right, so these were multiplication problems. I didn't get real organized here. I apologize. I'm going to change it up. I'm going to do division now. And you might end up with one that you just know what the answer is. Maybe it's a -12 divided by 2. Okay, well, 12 divided by 2 is 6, but the same rules apply with multiplication that do with division. I have one negative. That's an odd number of negatives, so my answer is going to end up a -6. You might have a division problem that you can't just do in your head. And so the one I have here is a -54 divided by a -3. All right, negative divided by a negative, that's two negative signs. So that means since 2 is an even number of negatives, then I'm going to have a positive answer. So my answer is positive. You may end up having to do a little bit of long division, like this. Remember doing this? When I do the division, I'm going to forget about the negatives. I just am going to have in my head, remember that my answer is going to be positive. All right, 3 goes into 5 once. 1 times 3 is 3. Then you subtract. 5 minus 3 is 2. Bring down your next number. And 3 goes into 24 evenly, goes in there 8 times. So my answer is 18. And one more time, since I had an even number of negative signs, then it's going to stay a positive 18 for my for my final answer. All right, one more thing that we need to be aware of when we're doing multiplication and division is anytime you're involving a zero. Okay, when you multiply by zero, anything times zero, 4 times zero, that equals 0. -4 times 0 still equals 0. We don't put a positive or a negative on 0. If you end up with, let's say, 2 times -3 times 0, don't really care about the 2 times the -3. I'm multiplying by a 0. It's going to end up being 0 anytime you're multiplying. Now, division works a little bit trickier because division with 0 sometimes works and sometimes it does not work. So if you have a 0 divided by 2, sometimes you're going to look at that as a 0 divided by 2 this way. Either way, that ends up equaling 0. 0 divided by anything is always going to be 0. However, it does not work the other way. So if you did 2 divided by 0, or even if you looked at it like 2 divided by 0 this way, you cannot divide by 0. This is considered undefined. If you were to type it in your calculator, which you shouldn't be, but it'll get you like an error message on a calculator. It is not allowed to divide by 0. So you have to kind of keep this straight on which way is it, and is it okay or is it not okay? So here's our little trick for doing that. I don't know if this maybe helps, or I don't know. If you're doing 0 divided by some number, I'm just saying 2, that is okay. And you're going to get a 0 for an answer. But if you're doing 2 divided by 0 like this, that is a no-go. No. See how I put the O's there? No, you can't do that. Or sometimes you'll see it like this. 0 divided by 2, this is okay. But 2 divided by 0 is a no. Can't do that. So okay means your answer is going to be fine. It's going to equal 0. A no means that it's undefined. So those would be your answers. Okay, so that's just a little trick that we use to help remember which one's which on that. Great. The next thing I want to look at is doing this multiplication and division, but kind of having to consider your order of operations as you do it. So remember your order of operations, parentheses, exponents, multiplication and division. These go at the same level. You just do them left to right. Addition and subtraction, again, just doing those left to right. Now, when we say parentheses, it really is any kind of grouping symbols. Those parentheses, they might be brackets instead of parentheses. But another thing that we use as a grouping symbol is this fraction bar right here. That is another grouping symbol because it separates your numerator from your denominator. So when you see this fraction bar, we typically work separately with your numerator and with your denominator. And then at the very end, we look at it like it's a division. It's a fraction where it's a division, and we'll do the division on it. So let's look at this first example. I have a -30 plus 6. Okay, that's going to end up getting me a -24. All right, so order of operations, I did the numerator and the denominator separately, and now I can just do this last step of division. 24 divided by 6, is 4. Do you think that's positive or negative, though? Should be negative because you only have one negative symbol in there. Okay, let's try this next one. I have a 4 times a -4 times another -4. So we are just multiplying straight across left to right up here in the numerator. Now let's get one thing out of the way. Do you feel like your numerator will end up positive or negative? Well, ideally you're thinking positive because you have 2 negative signs involved here. That's an even number of negative signs, so that's going to make it be positive. So the real trick is, what's 4 times 4? That's 16 times another 4. If you can't do it in your head, then you go kind of do this little side note gig over here. 4 times 4 was 16. I've got to take it times another 4. So 4 times 6 is 24. Carry that 2, which gets us a 6. Okay, so my answer is 64. And it should be a positive 64. And then nothing to do in the denominator, so I just write that 8. And now I'm actually looking at that fraction bar more as a division than a grouping symbol. And my answer would be a positive 8. Okay, last one like this. Why don't you give this one a shot on your own? Take a minute and pause the video and work through it on your own and then come back. All right, first thing you're going to do is work in that numerator. You have a negative 37 plus a negative 30. All right, so I've got a negative plus another negative. Man, that's going to be very negative. It's going to be a negative 67 is what that ends up combining to. Now I'm going to divide that by a negative 1. Okay, that part's not so hard. Dividing by 1 is just going to be a 67. But because I have an even number of negatives, it's going to be a positive 67. All right, let's try some other things with some order of operations. All right, so let's look at some of these that have a little bit more going on in them. Notice I didn't put any fraction bars here, but there still is division. Now, let's look at the first example here. There's no parentheses, there's no exponents, so I'm just going to jump right into multiplication and division left to right. So what that means is the first thing I come across is this right here, 5 divided by 5. So my first step is to do the 5 divided by 5, which is just a 1. All right. Don't be afraid to just show step after step after step on this. When people start taking shortcuts, that's usually where the errors begin. So looking at this one, the next level I see is this multiplication. So I have to do this multiplication before I do anything over here. So that means the 9 stays put, plus 1 times 8 is 8. And 9 plus 8 is 17. All right, so I didn't really have anything to worry about on the signs on that one. Let's look at this next one. All right, I do see parentheses on this one. So we have to work inside the parentheses first. So this 8 plus 4 is really a 12 squared. Then I'm going to leave the divide by, and I'm going to do this parentheses set. 3 plus 5 is 8. All right, so then the next thing is I'm going to go ahead and do the exponent. So 12 squared is 144 divided by 8. All right, I don't know what 144 divided by 8 is, so I have myself a little side note of taking my 144 and I'm dividing it by 8. So 8 doesn't go into 1, but it'll go into 14 one time. Put the 1 right above that 4 to indicate you're using the 14. And then 1 times 8 is an 8, and 14 minus 8 is 6. Bring down the next number because you do subtract that. Okay, bring down the next number. Okay, this is going to play out nice. So 8 goes into 64 evenly. It goes in there 8 times. And since it goes in there evenly, I have no remainder and I'm good to go. It's an 18 for my final answer on that. Again, didn't really worry about any negative signs. Okay, on the next one here, I do see a minus sign in there, so that might have to be something I consider. But more importantly, I'm worried about those parentheses. So let's go ahead and do our 1 times our 2 plus, and inside parentheses, I'm going to have a 3 squared. Now, I put the parentheses there. I didn't have to because those aren't really grouping symbols. All I'm doing is kind of like just tucking that 3 together. So there's nothing more to do inside the parentheses. I'm ready to go ahead and just do the exponent on that 3. So now I'm going to have 1 times 2 plus 3 squared is 9. All right, ready to move to multiplication and division. There is a multiplication step. Let's go ahead and do that. And then our last step is to add. And we end up with an 11. All right, last one on these order of operations, but you can see they're getting a lot more involved. So let's go through this. Remember, you're doing PEMDAS. However you remember that, if it's just PEMDAS or please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, whatever your trick is to remember your order of operations. So now I'm going to start with my parentheses on this first example. Now I got multiple sets of things going on here. I actually have these brackets, which are really equivalent to parentheses, just a different shape. I have these parentheses, but if you'll notice, there's no operation going on. It's just a number, a -4 sitting inside of that. So really all these parentheses are doing is sort of separating this negative from that negative. But we're going to end up doing a minus a negative number, which is going to turn into a plus a positive. Negative, a minus a negative is always a plus a positive. I also have parentheses out here at the end where I could do that 1 plus 3. So I'm going to go ahead and start off by doing that 2 plus 4, which is going to get me a 6. And I can put it in the brackets, but really all it's doing is squaring. So I'm just going to try to leave out the extra brackets and parentheses. It's just 6 squared. Divided by, and then I want to work inside these parentheses. 1 plus 3 is 4. All right, so the next level of order of operations is to deal with your exponents. That's my 6 squared, going to get me a 36. And then divide by 4, that ends up being a 9. Final answer, 9. Okay, on this next one, I'd like you to give this one a shot all on your own. Can you work through it? Don't get in a hurry. Try to do it step by step. Come back at the end and we'll see if you ended up with the right answer. Go ahead and pause the video. All right, I ended up with a 7. Did you? All right, I just did it step by step. First, I did my 6 minus 3, and then I did my exponent, and then I did that division, and then I did the multiplication, and then I did my subtraction. So look through that, pause the video, make sure if you didn't get it right, make sure you see where you went astray. Okay, last one, we're going to do this together. Because this has multiple sets of parentheses, but they're like nested inside of one another. When you have nested parentheses like that, you always want to work those inner to outer. So I'm going to start off here, and I'm going to have my 15 plus, I'm going to have my bracket, 11 divided by. But when I look at this whole set of parentheses, the first thing, the most innermost set, just has this 5 times 1. So that's where I'm going to start. I'm going to have a 6 plus, and then that 5 times 1 is just a 5. Close those parentheses, close those brackets. So I still have nested parentheses. So I'm going to work with the 6 plus 5 that's on the innermost part of those parentheses. So it's an 11 divided by 6 plus 5 is 11. Close that bracket. Ooh, man, we're going to get lucky here. Doing inside the parentheses, final step of that, 11 divided by 11 is just a 1. So final answer, 16. All right, so that's enough of order of operations. I have one other problem that is on this lesson that we should talk about. All right, this is the problem where they're asking you to find an average of a set of numbers. So to find the average of the numbers, the example I looked at, all the numbers ended up being negative. Okay, that's probably going to make my life a little easier. To find an average of a set of numbers, what you end up doing is you add them all up, and then you divide by how many numbers you just added up. So in this case, I'm adding up all 5 of these numbers, and then I'll come back and divide by 5. And that'll get me that average that I'm looking for. Now, instead of saying negative 86 plus negative 90, I went ahead and just called it minus 90. Plus a negative 1 is just a minus 1. So however you write that, that's fine. But ultimately, I'm adding up a whole bunch of negative numbers. If I add up a bunch of negative numbers, I'm just going to add them, and then I'm going to make my final answer be a negative, because since they're all negative, when I add them all up, they're going to stay negative. And how you do that, you could kind of do your left to right business, but since I'm just going to add, I might just do this. Here's my little side note. I'm going to take 86. I'm going to add 90 to it. I'm going to add 1 to it. I'm going to add 10 to it, and 23. And then I know at the end it's going to have to be a negative, because those really are all negative numbers. So when you add up this first column, you're going to have a 6 plus a 1, that's 7, plus 3 That's 10. So put the 0, carry the 1. So now what I have is a 1 plus 8, that's 9, plus another 9, that's 18, 19, 20, 21. So when I add this all up, I get a 21 there, or 210 is what this ends up being. And it actually ends up being a negative 210 since all those numbers were negative. So now here's where I'm at. And again, you're probably going to do some long division on this. Let's take 5 and let's divide it into 210. 5 does not go into 2, but it will go into 21 4 times. Make sure to put your 4 on top of that 1 to sort of show that placement. And now you take your 4 times 5 and you get a 20. All right, so draw the line and subtract. So 21 minus 20 is 1. Bring down the next number. So 0. And then we start all over. 5 goes into 10 twice. 2 times 5 is 10. When we subtract, we're going to end up with 0 remainder. Okay, so my answer there is a 42. But do you feel like your 42 should be positive or should be negative? All right, the average of all those numbers is going to be a negative 42. Okay, that's all I've got for you. I hope this helps. See ya.